Are we ready? I think so. All right. Hello, I'm Strietman. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Firstly, I just want to say it's such an honor to be back here. I'm really pleased to be here again, and such a privilege to be invited back. I must have done something right last time. I know I should have turned up with copies of the book in my hand. More on that later. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I've been looked after so well by the club members here, and it's just fun and a great pleasure, and I hope you enjoy this talk. So I'm going to do the talk in about 45 minutes. It's 72 slides, so I'm going to go quite quickly. There's some videos with audio and lots of images. If I'm talking too fast for anyone, or someone wants me to repeat something, stick your hand up and let me know, and I don't want anyone to miss out. So I'm going to talk about this expedition that I conducted in January and early February of this year to the Araguaia River Basin in Brazil, and the main feature of that were these lovely Ember Tetras. So we're going to go through here. So the Araguaia Basin is in sort of central Brazil, further to the north. This is an area called the Trans-Amazonian region. It's where the southern belly of the Amazon blends into the Cerrado grasslands. We're going to have a look at that in a moment. And you've got the watershed in this graphic here, and it's quite a large river basin. It actually forms two main rivers. So there's the Araguaia River and the Tocantins River. And they both drain south to north through this whole area of central Brazil, and they come out south of the mouth of the Amazon River. And they're large rivers. They go through 4 different states. Most of the habitat is this Cerrado biome. So this is savanna, dry grasslands, scrub forests, not the sort of typical wet rainforest that you might think of, but it has a very well-defined wet and dry season. So in the dry season, it's really dry. I mean, it's arid, things look dead, forests sort of look bleached white, the grasslands, all the grasses kind of die back. But then when the rains come, there's this explosion of life, everything turns green, forests get very lush, the grasslands come back to life, you have all these water meadows, all the waterways flood and expand. And during that wet season, it's 90% of the rain of the year falls in that period. The middle part of the Araguaia is the main part. It's about 720 miles long, and it's got lots and lots of small tributaries coming off into it from the east and west. In the east, you've got these highlands, so there's lots of small rivers draining down from there. And to the west, you've got more of the Amazon basin, so lots of water coming from the forests there. So within the context of Brazil, I don't know if you guys can see with my mouse up here. So we've got the Araguaia Basin is here on this map. And you can see that it's really at the southern, sort of southeastern edge of the wider Amazon basin. You can see some of the other famous Amazon rivers like the Xingu here and the Tapajós. So the Tocantins and Araguaia rivers, they drain up to the north, and they come out south of the mouth of the Amazon here. On this photo, or this graphic, sorry, we can see the impact of humanity on the Amazon basin. All of these little circles here, these are all hydroelectric dams, which are big barriers to fish migration. You guys might know the Belo Monte Dam on the Xingu. This flooded vast areas of forest. Some of the most famous loricarids, like the zebraplex, they come from the rapids that existed on that part of the Xingu. That's all gone. It's all reservoir now. There's loads of little roads appearing. Lots of land is cleared for agriculture, for cattle ranching, for soy. And a lot of what happens is forest is cleared, they plant soybeans, and they work it till the soil is exhausted, and then they plant invasive African grasses, which can live in that kind of environment, and they put cattle on it. So some of the big meat producers like JBS, big Brazilian firm, a lot of the beef that we might have in our McDonald's here, it's coming from this region. And in the last 40 years, the deforestation has really intensified, with lots of primary forests being cleared. And they get cleared along the rivers because you can send diggers and loggers and all the rest up the main rivers. And then once you establish a site, all these little tendrils of roads going out into the forest starts to get fragmented. I'm going to try not to get too negative about all the environmental stuff, but I do think it's important to show it to you guys, because the fishes that we love in the hobby, many of them are not living in pristine habitats, as we're going to see. So the local area of the expedition where I was in the town of Araguaia, literally Araguaia. This is the Trans-Amazonian region, so you get loads of species that we think of being as Amazonian, all this way down south, like Arowana, Boto river dolphins, Arapaima, jaguars, all this kind of stuff. And the town of Araguaia was traditionally a frontier town. It was the last town before you crossed the river, the Tocantins, west into the Amazon, where there were lots of very unhappy, understandably unhappy indigenous tribes who didn't want European settlers coming in, and lots of diseases and wildlife, and it was sort of the edge of the world for the colonial period in Brazil. Now, the Araguaia River used to have lots of artisanal fishing, people fishing for survival, for their own needs. That's all been banned, and now it's only sports fishing. All fishing is catch and release, and it's become this incredible hub. The town of Araguaia, its economy is entirely reliant on sports fishing. Previously, it used to be collecting for the aquarium hobby, and then around the town there is cattle ranches, there's soy farms, but most of the year the town is dead. You go in the sports fishing season, and there's tens of thousands of people down there and coming onto the river. So I've mentioned some of these environmental impacts. A big thing around there is cattle ranching. And a little example here in this video that we see here, the cattle coming down to a stream where we hope to snorkel and crossing it. And these streams, they would have had lots of riparian vegetation, so plants growing along the margins. They've all been trampled down by the cattle coming to drink, and the banks get churned into mud. So all the complex habitat that was there for fishes and all the aquatic plants like Echinodorus and other species that would be growing there, they're gone. And you replicate this thousands of times across thousands of little farms and ranches, you begin to see it has a huge impact. The other issue is down here you see these floating water pumps. These are all along the Araguaia. They're sucking out water for the soy plantations and other farms. And they're essentially like a big turbine, and there's no grill or filter on there. So if you're a small fish, you're going in and ending up as fertilizer on the fields. And then you have large areas of forest that were cleared to create cattle pasture, which floods as well, which we'll look at. So what I thought I'd do for this presentation, there's a lot of ground to cover, so I thought I'd divide it into three sort of chapters, if you like. We've got flooded waterways, which includes the streams, the rivers, creeks and channels. We've got the temporary pools, which is isolated pools and ditches and ponds and small lakes that fill up with floodwaters in the wet season. And then we've got the flooded meadows. These are the grasslands which get inundated either by rainwater and or water coming out of the main river. So we'll start with our flooded waterways. So we talked a little bit about the Araguaia River. It's huge. It's home to over 800 species of fish. When I worked in the Pantanal, we had 330. And we thought, wow, that's quite a lot. Here we've got 800. In the UK, we have 47, of which 11 are invasive. I think Illinois, well, is it Wisconsin has something like 300 and something. So it shows you how impoverished we are in the UK. So when you're somewhere where there's 800 species of fish, pretty cool. When I was looking up the watershed area, it told me it was about the size of Germany. So I was trying to translate that for my American audience. And I figured it equates to about the size of Montana. So it's a pretty large drainage basin. And it runs for over 1,400 miles, south to north. Unfortunately, when I was there, it was the heaviest rains they'd had for 20 years. So the river was really high, really turbid. It could get pretty crazy on the water. In the dry season, this huge river, you can walk across it. It goes down to less than a meter, gets quite clear. But in the wet season, you can see the extreme difference here. So you can see that along the waterway, you have these ancillary forests. These are the forests that grow following the main rivers and the streams. And these areas are normally where forest doesn't get removed. Because it floods so intensely in the wet season, it's impossible to put cattle or agriculture there. So this is how you have these sort of columns of green growing across the landscape. And I was in the north of the state of Tocantins, and I wanted to go to this place called the Ilha de Bananal. It's the largest riverine island in the world. And I knew that there were Ember Tetras there. But my professor who I was with was saying, unfortunately, it's largely indigenous communities that live there. It's indigenous land. We'd really have to navigate with each community where we can go and how we can go in, and it will be heavily flooded. However, if we go 500 miles south, we've got some collection points around the town of Araguaia, which is what we did. The Araguaia around Araguaia was pretty turbid. I had hoped maybe to snorkel in some flooded forest. As you can see, visibility was a bit limited in much of it, but there were some areas in recently flooded areas, very shallow, where we could get into the water and we could see things. So we're going to show you that. So there's a video here, and I hope there's audio that you guys can hear. So we've stopped in this sort of bahia off the main river channel, and we are
looking at the different fishes that we've seen here. We've seen some juvenile cupid cichlids, some fish which are called matrinchá, or qual é o nome científico, Fernando? Matrinchá?
Qualquer aqui, amazônicos.
Falcatus. It's an important forest engineer. Eats lots of seeds and fruits and then disperses them. But the thing that's caught my attention, I'm going to try not to fall over as I clamber over Fabricio, is we have Carajal here. He's feeding a bunch of penguin tetras.
This is the scientific method, biscuits.
I don't know if you guys can see that. I've done some underwater footage, but there's a whole bunch of penguin tetras here. See the leaf litter? And they're coming up from about 10 to 30 centimeters depth. So yeah, there were some juvenile cupid cichlids here. There's a couple of other little tetras. But so cool to see wild penguin tetras.
So this is a habitat of dry forest where it's almost like dunes near a small farmstead along the edge of the river. And the water was pretty clear there. We'll look a bit more. And there was loads and loads of leaf litter from the trees that were around. It wasn't that thick forest, but there was still lots of leaf litter on the ground. And the small fishes, particularly penguin tetras, had moved in along with the small cichlid, the cupid cichlid, Biotoderma cupido. However, there weren't that many different species, and there weren't that many of the fishes that were there. This is because the flood was so extensive that the fishes are dispersed across the landscape, right? So in any given place, there's not that many. There's so much water they can go into. And that was a bit challenging, but you can see the water is quite clear, but still stained from all the tannins, from all that leaf litter. And usually we would expect to find a larger community of small tetras, different characins here, particularly in the wet season, because they move in to eat off seeds and insects and fallen fruit, breed amongst the sunken branches and so on. However, I think because this area was maybe very recently flooded, and there were only a few fishes that had moved into it. It was near to a farmstead, so that there's cattle around, there's people, there's boats. Quite a few species might go somewhere where it's a bit quieter, deeper into the forest. But I thought this is quite an easy biotope if you wanted to create it at home, like in a shallow tank. Just play sand, leaf litter, and a bunch of penguin tetras and maybe some cupid cichlids. Super easy biotope. So here we are feeding our expensive biscuits to the penguin tetras. And they were quite large. Often in the wild you find the tetras that we see in the hobby really, really small because they only live maybe one season and they're constantly swimming, they're constantly trying to find food, they've got all these pressures on them, like predation pressures. So it's like being a marathon athlete. You're not going to get chubby always running around. However, these penguins are quite large, so it suggests that they are more than a single season species, which also tells you how they are good at being opportunistic and taking advantage of any and all resources that are available to them. They'll eat whatever, including biscuits. And because they are so opportunistic, they're often one of the first to colonize newly flooded areas, right? They go and move in, find whatever they can.
I got one question.
Sure.
So is this typical for the color of the water all year long, or is this seasonal? Or?
Yes, so in the dry season it might be a bit clearer because there's less leaf litter submerged in the habitats. The water has reduced into the main river channels. So, like I said, it can be very, very concentrated and very shallow. In the wet season, as more forest is flooded over a longer period and there's more organic matter sitting in the water, the tannins can increase and increase. But the wet seasons aren't linear. It's not like it starts raining and the water just keeps rising over the days and weeks. Maybe it rains really heavily, there's a sudden flood, and then it doesn't rain for a week and the water drains down, and it can go up and down. So you can get changes in the amount of tannins that are entering the water throughout the wet season. But this is quite typical of a lot of the tropical habitats in this part of the country. And you can see this flooded forest where it was about a meter and a half deep. We had the green lizard tetras, these beautiful torpedo-like fish, Iguanodectes spirulus. I haven't kept them at home myself because they're never in the hobby in the UK, but also they love to jump, and I don't have tanks without lids. So, and they're quite expensive, so you have a $40 fish that just jumps out. It's not ideal. We also found some cichlids in here, which I'll show you. And these spirulus, they're primarily insectivorous fish, so they're hunting for insects at the surface, but they'll also take small seeds and nip at detritus. So here we've got a pair of earth eaters. This is Satanoperica papaterra, which is my favorite fish name because it translates basically as Satan's earth-eating perch, which is I think pretty good for a Latin name. But you can see they're using this tangle of submerged roots and branches, which perhaps a week before was high and dry, to get away from me. So this really crucial, complex habitat. So often when you think about making your aquascapes or your biotopes or whatever, if you think about, okay, where can my fish go and hide? Where can I create those broken lines of sight so that if he doesn't want to be seen, he can go, and then the fish feel more comfortable, better behavior, and nicer colors. But these iguanodectes, they were out and about in the open, hunting at things at the surface, and the habitat had lots of submerged grasses, loads of submerged palm fronds. When I worked at London Zoo, we used to go to the keepers from the gorilla enclosure and ask them for palm fronds, which they would give to us to put in the exhibits. But you could even go around to garden centres here and say, hey, have you got any slightly dried out old plants or anything, and see if you can get them to give you some palm fronds, because they make really nice sort of natural botanicals in a biotope tank. Couldn't really find any aquatic plants in this habitat, partly because it's probably been very recently flooded, and before that it was baked by the sun. The other tetra we found here was a Brachionops. These are these lovely chunky tetras with huge eyes, and they can jump up to 1 meter out of the water to grab insects from the air. So all the species that we found here, the iguanodectes, the penguin tetras, and the Brachionops, primarily insectivorous fishes. So there's lots of open surface area, so that's probably why they're there, hunting for insects above the water. A few more of the botanicals, so different palm fronds and bits of tree and bits of palm seed pods. There was some submerged grasses. There was this plant down here, which I think is possibly a kind of Madania. Could even be Engelsei, but I couldn't identify it. I didn't have my botanist friend on hand with me. So then we went to an area where supposedly it was only going to be 0.5 meter deep, and it would have crystal clear water, and I could snorkel, and it took us about 3 hours on the boat to get there. But we got there, and instead of being 0.5 meter deep, it was 5 meters deep. This photo is the tops of the trees that we were supposed to be shading under. So it was a bit difficult. But on the very, very, very shallowest parts, we found more of the iguanodectes, and we found these Hemiodas. I'm not sure which species, but slightly bigger characins. They like to hug the substrate, picking up food there. So I'd been told, oh, there's loads of aquatic plants in these lagoons, in this habitat. It'll be really great. You'll be able to film them and see them all. Well, there was some kind of Sigonanthus, but the floodwaters, the rising floodwaters, had basically ripped it out of the substrate and left it all floating on the surface, wrapped around the tops of the trees. So I couldn't really get into the water. It was too deep. The visibility wasn't great. And even if I could, all the fishes, again, were really dispersed, and the plants had been torn apart, which was a shame because I've been really excited. But one of the problems, you go on an expedition, you travel, 10,000 miles across the world, you get to this place, you drive, you go on boats, and the weather and the conditions just haven't cooperated. That's just part of the deal and the risk you take. But you do get to see cool stuff anyway. So we were on the river, and you can see it's really brown and murky, but the sun came out, so 1 minute it's kind of cloudy, next minute it's very, very sunny. I don't tan very well, as you probably guess. I lived in a community in Brazil where they called me Gringo Camarão, which is the prawn gringo, because it took me a while to build up some color that wasn't just beetroot. So we're on the river, and we're heading back to base, but the weather in the wet season can really, really change very quickly. Storm came in a shallow-bottomed boat. The pilot's trying to race the storm back to town. And I was thinking, if we go in, who am I saving? Probably the pilot can swim. The other professor who's there, I think he can swim, but my professor, who's an ichthyologist, Dr. Fernando, he's a specialist on Hyphus, he can't swim. And so do I save him or my camera kit? Yeah. Well, I often seen him on the edge of raging rivers with a net, sort of dipping in. And I think, if he goes in, well, what am I going to do? But we got back to town, and after about 5 minutes of rain, this is what it looked like. I mean, this is the road. Yep. There we go. All right, back to the hotel, have a hot shower, and recover. That was a long day. I didn't have to go to a tent or a hammock. We were in this town. There was air conditioning, hot showers, beds. I'm only 37, but I'm done with sleeping on jungle floors. I would rather have, people are, it's really cool and, adventurous. Like, it's not. There's mosquitoes, there's snakes, there's all sorts of stuff. Give me the comforts any day. So moving on to chapter 2, these are these temporary pools. So this is actually a pool fed by a swamp that's draining through a culvert. We'll have a look at that. And these pools are often quite transparent. They're filled mostly with rainwater or runoff from the river that's already had time for lots of the sediment to sink. And because they're quite transparent, you get aquatic plants. So it's a good place to get into the water, good visibility, you can see lots of fish. Because there's lots of plants, there's lots of animals, and it's good to make underwater observations. So when we were trying to figure out where do we find ember tetras around the town, we had some collection points from data, but we went to an old a tackle shop and we talked to the owners, and they used to collect ornamental fishes. And they were like, oh no, you don't need to go far, you just go out of town, up the road, there's a private property, knock on the door, you'll find ember tetras. Turned out this was a property that was rented out to fishermen during the sports fishing season as a sort of like simple lodge to stay in. And the owner wasn't there, but the caretaker let us in and was quite happy for us to come and have a look. And this was the habitat.
Look at all the Pseudroides. It's a plant very difficult to maintain in the aquarium. It likes acid water, loads of sun. Beautiful.
So it's formerly a natural sort of stream that's been converted within the grounds of this house to a sort of more domestic situation. And I got very excited because we found ember tetras. Just about to see these little guys here. So that was really, really cool. And the habitat was full of Icornia diversifolia, which we've actually got some for our display tank later. It's quite a fast-growing plant. It's found across this huge area. It'll grow in rivers, it'll grow in still areas, full shades, full sun, even in shade. It often looks really manky in the wild. It's covered in detritus and algae. It's a very common plant. In the aquarium, it can grow quite large, so you might find yourself hacking it back with a machete. That's fine. You can always substitute it for stargrass, Heteranthera zostifolia, which looks very similar, grows quite fast but stays a bit smaller. And I've got another video here.
Oh look, here's a tetra which has been parasitized by the parasite which augments the guanine in the scales, thus making it more visible, thus making it predated, eat more easily, so a heron or a kingfish or a bigger predator will eat it, and then the parasite completes its life cycle in the guts of the bigger predator. Isn't nature amazing?
Isn't nature amazing? So you know the lovely gold tetras you see in the hobby? Those are the ones that have been, it's not like there's a shoal of gold tetras in the wild. The collectors have gone out and collected the individuals within populations that have been parasiticized by this parasite and take them out, put them together. Those are the gold tetras. But it can happen to lots of other fishes. I've found it with serpe tetras, black neons, various hemigrammus, red-eye tetras, and it's like a death sentence for the fish, because if I was a heron or a kingfisher, I can easily see that guy and snap him up. So here's some of the Icornia diversifolia underwater, and there's a palm frond that's fallen in. You see this really lush habitat, clear water, loads of small fishes, and especially when you've got lots of flow, the Icornia looks really cool. So we're going to delve into some of the different species and dynamics of this habitat. We can see there's a lot going on, and there's some marginal grasses, and there's some penguin tetras that show up. Looking very lovely, I think so. Right, next one. So you can see this pipe. This is the culvert under the road, and the water is draining from a swamp which is being flooded by the river a few miles further west. It drains through these pipes. There were bats living in the pipes as well, and then comes through into this area where there was loads of vegetation. So there's lots of nutrients and food being blown into the habitat, which means there's loads of fish and plants, including our ember tetras. So I was able to snorkel in the water. Fish didn't really mind me being in there. In fact, they like to pick at me. I often find this, that you're snorkeling and someone's trying to rip out an eyebrow hair or something from your leg. It can be quite uncomfortable because they can be quite determined to pull it out. But this isn't just something that happens in Brazil. Last week I was in a creek in Missouri, and some sunfish were biting my nipple through my shirt. I was really keen. And at first I was like, oh, they're so cute, look how they're underneath me. And then, ow. Some people pay good money for that kind of thing, but it was not what I wanted. And actually this habitat, the caretaker said, oh, when it's flooded, the guests never go in because they think it's full of snakes, and we think there's a caiman that lives in there. We didn't see it, but in this part of the country they have the black caiman. I'm used to the yellow caiman of the Pantanal, which is 3 meters, quite a social animal, never attacks people. The black caiman gets up to 5.5 meters and will hunt people. So, but normally they don't like clear water habitats, so we were fine. But the other thing she said was in the dry season, all the water, all the fish, and all the plants were gone. So either they die from the evaporation of the water, or they're predated, or if they're lucky, they follow the water as it recedes out the habitat back across the meadows to the main river. So the recent heavy rains had filled these pools. They were all connected up. There was all this water flowing through the culvert, creating the current. And as I said, the current brings food items. So most of these fishes are drift picking. They're darting up into the flowing water to snap at things that are coming past in the flow. And this is really typical of the flood pulse dynamic of tropical habitats, where you have dry season, everything kind of dies back, it looks pretty desolate. And then wet season, the rains come, there's this explosion of life. All those plants in the dry season, sure, they die, but they go down into the substrate, they rot, they drop all their seeds, the rotting vegetation provides the nutrients for those seeds, and the next rain cycle, boom, everything grows back. So it can really transform. I don't know if you guys can see, but in here is a pike cichlid, and he was using the column of plants to climb up to get near to the Ember Tetras so he could ambush them. They're very fun fish, but they're quite voracious. So I know you guys are plant focused, so I've tried to do a bit more plant stuff. Ludwigia inclinata, which is one of my absolute favorite plants, and in this habitat it was quite lovely.
So look at this matrix of plants. You've got the Pseudoides, you've got the Icornia. You've got what to my eyes looks like Ludwigia inclinata.
See how red that
But when
is
it's in its immersed form, I thought it might be Rotala espigoeus, but it's actually no, I think it is a Ludwigia. Got the grasses.
So this plant's quite challenging in the aquarium. It likes soft, acidic water, lots of light, lots of nutrients. Doesn't like being moved around. I can get it in the UK now, which is great. But it tends to sort of boom and bust. It grows really well for a few months and then it kind of fades away. I think you guys can get it here in the US fairly easily, and it's definitely worth trying. In the wild, it doesn't always look that nice. It's covered in detritus and algae, but it provides loads of cover for fishes. And the other one that's just even more challenging is the Ludwigia pseudoides. This is a really difficult plant, at least in my experience. And it grows on this sort of long stem out of the substrate, grows up to the surface, and then sits there with this beautiful mosaic. And underneath the pads, the sort of this red-orange color, needs lots and lots and lots of light, lots of nutrients. Some people grow it in sort of very shallow trays in greenhouses in just an inch or so of water. I don't know if anyone here has tried to propagate it or grow it themselves, but it's in the UK. It's something, if you can get it, it will basically die. My water's far too hard for it. And again, in the dry season, it all goes down into the substrate. The tissues melt away. The seeds are in the substrate, nicely fertilized. They come back the following wet season. So from above, it's a different color. It's lovely and green. And as I said, it's a really challenging plant. Needs really good light, really good substrate. Doesn't like flow. Well, here it is growing in concrete at the edge of the culvert in quite a lot of flow, shaded by trees, and thriving. So it shows that nature always does it better, right? We can give it the most expensive lighting and substrates and CO2 and all the rest, and it's quite happy growing in a sewer. So, but it's a lovely plant. Another one which we've got some of today is Cobomba facata. So you guys may have seen it as more purple or pink. In the wild, I've often found it to be the sort of soft yellowy orange color. Really nice Cobomba. It's another species that likes soft acidic water, lots of CO2, lots of light. Again, it's a plant that can be quite challenging in the aquarium. I found it doesn't like being pruned. If you cut it, it sort of sulks and starts to fragment. But there was lots of it in this habitat, and it provides these really soft, lovely textures. And if you can get it to the surface and get it flowering, it has these beautiful little purple flowers.
What's the water temperature like?
I didn't have any way of measuring the parameters, but I think I've got to think in Fahrenheit now. Was it bald eagles per hamburger conversion? 20, it's probably about 25, 26 Celsius. So, yeah. I mean, you'll find plants growing, so in the Pantanal, everything from 18 Celsius to about 37. Just depends on how shallow, deep the water is, if it's sunny. But yeah, that was kind of the temperature there, I think. And in this habitat, it just blends in with the Icornia. You can see everything covered in detritus, covered in fluff. In the aquarium, you can try and clean it with a turkey baster. Just gently blast it with jets of water. Keeps the leaves clean of any detritus.
What is that fish that is?
This is a kind of Poptella. It's a deep-bodied charasin. In the Pantanal, we've got Poptella paraguayensis, and they're quite cool. Typical in flooded ephemeral habitats. They move in from the main river. They love eating fruits and seeds, and loads of these fishes are actually what we call ecosystem engineers. So they move into the habitat, they eat the seeds, they swim through the flooded landscape, they deposit the seeds somewhere else, and they end up gardening, essentially. So a lot of the Amazonian and Pantanal fruits and berries and such, it's more fishes than birds that are spreading those seeds around. So stars of the show were the Ember Tetras, and they were amazing. They were really tiny and very colourful. So the colour probably comes from the fact they're just eating loads and loads of tiny invertebrates. There's lots of food items in there. They've got a rich diet. Maybe also something to do with water parameters, very acidic water. The size suggests that they probably only live one season. So within a season, they mature, they breed, they scatter the eggs. The adults mostly perish when the dry season comes in, but the eggs might sit in plant matter in very, very shallow pools and shallow ditches. Rains come and then hatch as tiny fry. By the time the rains come back, those little fry are getting to the stage where they can breed again. And so we were finding them in little groups of a dozen, and then suddenly shoal of hundreds, or maybe even 1,000 or more. And they would do these kind of laps around the stream, so they'd swim up against the current, go across it, zoom down, come across again. And this is also a good way of just avoiding being predated. If you sit in one place, eventually a kingfisher or a pike cichlid or something is going to start hitting you. So you just keep moving. The predation pressures on these small fishes are really intense. The chances of living to be old, you go into an aquarium store here and you see a little tetra with a bent back or a slightly deformed tail or something. That just doesn't happen in the wild. Anything, the moment it gets a little old and a bit slow, it gets predated. So we found other species there, like the red-eyed tetra, which used to be Munchausia. Now it's Barrio Sanctofilomene. In Brazil, they call it the Tetra chapada, the stoned tetra, because of the red eyes. They're quite nice little fish. And also the head and tail-like tetras. Holopristis ocellifer used to be hemigramus. So they're in that habitat. Obviously, we had our penguin tetras, which are zooming all over the place, and the green lizard tetras. There were some other small characins, which I couldn't identify beyond just the genus, but things like Phenacogasta, the Poptella, Serpinus, Morcausia, Hemigramus, and most of them hang out kind of near the plants and sort of venture out briefly into the open water, then back to the plants. So here's a good example of the habitat of the other side of the road, which was the swamp area, and this was dominated by Cobomba covered in algae. There's a few Nymphea, and it was less speciose, so there were fewer species. It was dominated mostly by these Astyanax, probably Astyanax goianensis, these big chunky tetras. Astyanax is a huge family. You get them from Texas down to Argentina. And wherever you find water, you find these guys. So that for some reason, the Ember tetras weren't here, the penguin tetras weren't here, even though it was just on the other side of the highway. Now, there's lots of algae in this habitat, probably because runoff from the farms in the area was flowing in, coming into the swamp. And so there's all this filamentous algae. We found evidence of collecting nets for ornamental fishes. So probably someone had been collecting, and maybe the things like the embers and the penguins, you get someone harassing the habitat enough, they went through the pipework to the private property where no one could get at them. And that's why they were staying there rather than out here where it was accessible from the roadside. So I'm snorkeling through here, and occasionally the water's kind of shifting because it's the highway and there's these huge 18-wheeler trucks with logs or soy coming past. So it's not like a remote habitat away from everything. We're a mile outside of town and on the edge of a really busy road. So yeah, you see how that algae makes it difficult to move as soon as you swim. I'm not using fins or anything, I was just sort of doggy paddling very gently, but the algae breaks off, gets in front of your mask, in the camera, all over the place. And when you get in the car, as I was the only one in the water, when you get in the car afterwards, you're not very popular because you stink of swamp and slowly drying algae. So yeah, it's not always the best to be the one guy who gets in the water. There was a kind of nymphaea there. It was really, really beautiful. I don't know what species it was, but it had these like arrow-shaped leaves. And from underneath, it was really crimson red. And from the surface, it was this speckledy green, which I'll show you up here. But you see in this photo, the stems, they create these broken lines of sight, which is really good for fishes. It means that a predator can't see them straight away. They can zip through, but also they were trapping all the algae. So you had these weird kind of corridors with walls of algae that was gliding through. So here you can see the lily pads on the surface. Everything from, they look like almost begonia colors, red and then green with red spots. This is very typical flooded sort of swamp habitat. There's some big palm trees in here, caranda palms. It's one of the only palm trees that can sit in water year long. So often where you find caranda, you find water sources. And you may have seen them in Ivan Mikolji in his book about the Orinoco. He's got lots of photos of them in there.
It's almost like a sagittifolia.
Sorry, mate?
It's almost like a sagittifolia.
It looks like it. Well, we'll see something that I think is a Sagittaria later. But these, I think, are an nymphaea. The other plant we had in there was Pontidaria crassipes, which you've got it in its underwater form here, where it grows along a stem with these beautiful long leaves. And then it hits the surface, and it puts out these sort of floating islands with the flowers, which eventually break off, flow down river. When the water levels fall, they sit on the mud, put in their roots. The process starts again. It's one of the fastest growing and most invasive plants on the planet. There's large areas of Africa and Asia where it's so dense that big ships moving along large rivers just can't get through. It gets caught up in the turbines. But in its natural habitat, it's just part of the ecosystem. And lots of fishes like to live right underneath it, especially because insects and stuff are crawling along the floating elements. And the small fish can zip up and predate them. There's also the flooded grasses. So quite a few of these grasses can survive for days, weeks, even months being submerged. Eventually they will start to rot. But all that really complex habitat, all those stems, the leaves, that's a great space to go and avoid being predated if you're a small fish. But if you eat small fishes, it's also a good place to go and lay an ambush. So it's not always very, very safe. And again, insects, seeds that are found on the leaves and the emergent leaves, the small fish will go in and eat them, particularly the penguin tetras zipping around grabbing stuff, and other things eating the grass seeds. We also found, unfortunately, invasive guppies in here, but you find them everywhere. So you can see the embers here shoaling at the mouth of the culvert. And in the culvert was pike cichlids and some other cichlids. I wasn't quite brave enough to swim into that dark tunnel, so I'm going to hang out. But the sun came out for a minute, and I thought I'd just show off a little bit, and sent this to my friend afterwards, like, you know how I said I was going to go and try and find ember tetras? Well, guess what? And they were really, really cool. They weren't really bothered by me. And there was some small mid-water carasidium, these little data characins, and they were swimming amongst the embers as well. It's a really lovely fish. But yeah, you can see the color there. And I always sound, it's funny, like when I see these kind of things, I get quite excited. I'm sort of giggling, which is why I've not included the audio in here. And my professor once described it as like an elephant having a stroke, because all you can hear is this kind of and honking through the snorkel. But I find other language to describe it. Excitement. So one thing to note, this habitat less than 40 years ago would have been within primary forest, so it would have been shaded by big trees. There would have been loads of roots in there. There would have probably been the stream, but it would have been more like a forest creek as we imagine it, like the Igapos of the Amazon. However, this whole area within the last 40 years has been turned from forest to agricultural, mostly agricultural land. We've got the infrastructure of the road, the drainage pipes, culverts, but these animals still find a way to survive within this environment. I think that's quite amazing, actually. Even these tiny, tiny little creatures finding a way to adapt and survive despite our actions. So speaking of that, you can see on this map here, you see wherever there's this dark green, that's where you have a little water course, like a creek or a stream. You've got the town of Araguaia here, and here you have the river itself. And we were on the road here, where this water course, this is the swamp, drains through the road, and the pools connect, drain up here. And then you can see how the landscape around has been transformed. So if we zoom out, you can see that I'll leave the mouse where we were. Look at the Ember Tetras, just there. And then you can start to see how everywhere that isn't dark green used to be dark green. And this is mostly within the last 40 years. And most of this is soy and cattle ranch. So you see in the west here's the river basin, which is sort of swampland. Here you've got this range of hills, and all of this area in here should have been the same color as this. So you can see how, and here again you see within Bolivia, how the Amazon, the belly of the Amazon, is being fragmented. So the deforestation kind of from Peru, across Bolivia, up through North Brazil, all of this would have once been this color. And that's mostly within the last 40 years. So I know it's depressing, but I do think it's important to show and let people actually visualize how, when they say, oh, this many football fields are being deforested every day, okay, but what does that look like? Well, it looks like this. So we didn't have any equipment to measure water parameters. Unfortunately, another team from the university had taken that equipment. It was a $20,000 piece of kit, so there was we didn't have it with us. But I think 80 Fahrenheit, roughly. And the water was pretty soft and acidic, judging by the species of plants present. There was quite a bit of sediment in the water, even though it looks pretty clear. But that was coming through from the swamps. And the substrate was this sort of clay brown sand with leaf litter mixed in. Final chapter. I think we're doing okay for time. All right. Again, if I'm going too fast, let me know. Final chapter is this is the flooded meadows. So even when this area was primarily forest, there would have been open fragments of grassland and savanna. Often these habitats would have been, the easiest to be flooded. Now, so much of the landscape has been transformed into cattle pasture, and it floods, but it's not as productive as the original swamps, because it's more recent. And we did go and sort of net through some of these habitats. You had to be quite careful of snakes, because snakes love this kind of environment. But you also find different kinds of killifish. We mostly found those tetras again, the Astyanax goianensis, and we found a few other creatures. So here's me splashing around. One nice thing about the Araguaia is there's not very many mosquitoes. In the Pantanal at this time of year, I wouldn't have been able to hear myself think because of all the mosquito noises. For some reason, in the Araguaia, it's not quite as bad, so that was nice. And as you can see, lots of trees in that water. They can survive many weeks or months with their feet wet, essentially. But in the dry season, this is sort of dusty cattle pastures. So we found things like there's a little killifish here. This is probably Melanorivius carajá. Small killie, quite common in the area. And these are juvenile golden wolffish, Hoplioerythrinus uniteniatus. They get about a foot and a bit long, and they're pretty voracious. And they can climb out of the water, breathe atmospheric air. So if a pool is shrinking, they'll climb out, wriggle until they find another pool, and go in it. And you see them in the trade in the UK for about $60, $70 each. And out there, we would use them as bait fish. And they're pretty voracious predators, and they bite. I know they bite because I once caught a little one like that whilst I was in a lake. I didn't have anywhere to put him apart from the shorts of my swim shorts. So I put him in there, and he let me know he wasn't pleased about it later on. And yeah, so no more wolffish in the pocket. Lots of freshwater crabs. So these really important food for lots of birds, fishes, small mammals as well that go hunting for them. We found these water scorpions, which are really nasty sort of water beetles. They will eat frogs, small fish, and they have a very, very painful sting, so I was trying to avoid them. They bite hard, they're really nasty. So we thought we'd follow this road away from the town of Araguaia up to another town called Cocalina. It's about 80 miles, but because of the heavy rains, you can see it wasn't in great condition, lots of mud, the trucks sliding all over the place. And the meadows on either side were still pretty turbid. Many of them were quite deep. So it was too dark for me to get in and film or see anything, and too deep really for us to try and collect anything with the nets, which is really, really frustrating. And again, the animals are dispersed right across the landscape. However, we did find a few areas with some clearer water. And again, we found the same fishes, the Astyanax goianensis, lots of wolffish, and some aquatic plants, which I'll come on to in a second. So,
Fernando spotted what we think maybe a Laeticara in this habitat.
So we saw Laeticara araguaia here.
Eleucharis, there's the lilies, there's some sort of isoetes type looking thing. And in and amongst that, in about 5 to 10 centimetres of water, there is Araguaia. Now I think these aren't nymphaea, I think this is a kind of Sagittaria, because if, I don't know if you guys can see, but if you look at the base of the plant, it's got leaves that look a bit like a Helanthium bolivianum, or a Sagittaria, underwater. That's why I think this is Sagittaria rather than nymphaea. But I may be wrong, I'm happy to be proved wrong.
So you guys probably know better than me, but maybe kind of Sagittarifolia, Sagittaria or something. This is right on the edge of a cattle pasture in private land, and I was just leaning on the fence and looking in. And at the edges of lots of the farms, you've got these sort of little drainage ditches, and these are very ephemeral, so they'll fill up with water maybe for a few days, then it doesn't rain for a day or two, the water drains back down, then it fills up. The only aquatic plant we found here was a kind of Eleocharis, and again the small characins, members of Hemigrammus, Odontostilbe as well. And there was one cool place we found at the entrance to a farm where there was a small culvert under the entrance to the road, and the water flowing down, the rains trigger the small fishes into this sort of salmon-like spawning behavior where they swim upstream, because they mostly will swim up to where they themselves were born. They spawn there. And even though we've put barriers in the way like these culverts and these pipes, they're still trying to get upstream. And they were being attacked by young golden wolffish that were hitting these shoals. So I can show you here. So all this here is small fishes.
Tudo jeju isso aqui.
Now the wolffish have just jumped out.
Oh, big go.
Because they're so excited attacking that they just launch.
Look at that. Literally jumped into Fernando's hands.
And
actually the wolffish,
you see they're trying to swim up through the pipe.
Tetras over there. So you can see the larger wolffish. If I move my head to the shadows. Oh, see, he's just jumped out. So there are some predatory attacks going on.
So again, within 40 years, this would have been rainforests or dry forests. Now it's converted to farmland. There would have been probably a little shallow depression which filled with water. Now it's been sort of humanized with the culverts and the pipework. But the fishes are just doing what they've done for millennia, which is try and swim up these existing waterways. And then they'll spawn upstream, and the eggs are washed all the way downstream, and then it starts again. So we kept driving up the road, and I was getting really despondent because I thought, well, none of these habitats are good for Ember tetras. We've not really found anything. And then we found one area of flooded meadow where one of the guys said, oh, the water's quite clear, and I think you can probably find Ember tetras here. And I thought, well, I'm going to have a go. It's late in the day. So I sort of sulked, went back to the truck to get my mask and snorkel. And I glanced down at this puddle next to the truck.
Can you believe in this puddle by the side of the highway? It's full of fish, including Ember tetras.
So I'll explain how this happened, but I'll show you here.
So the road must have been flooded, then it's drained out, and these little Ember tetras have got trapped. Look at him. Tell me that's not an Ember tetra. In fact, I might be able to get him with my hands.
It's like the worst day of
Don't want to hurt him, you see. Very sensitive. Little individuals. Come here. Oh, you bugger. One Ember tetra, wild. Caught in a tiny puddle on the side of the road.
So the meadow on the west side of the road has flooded. The water has burst over the road. It's running across it and draining down an embankment into a ditch and meadows on the east side. But then if the rains have stopped for the morning, the waters just start to recede, and then there's these depressions in the road. They become puddles, and if the fish haven't zipped out, they get stuck there. And if they're not, if they don't find a way out, they get predated by herons. So you can see all the prints of all the birds' feet around where they've been snapping things up. But I called my professor Fernando over, and he said, oh, there's something else here.
Que achou?
Uma crenicicla.
Preso.
Sim.
That is amazing. A pike cichlid, also trapped after the waters flooded the road and retreated, and he's still alive. Oh, wow, beautiful. Look at that.
So I did throw him back in the wetland on the other side. But this is part of the cycle, right? The flood pulse cycle. These animals, if they're not predated directly by birds and other things, or even ants, we found desiccated fish covered in ants, those nutrients go back into the soil. That sustains the plants, which sustains the animals, and then the next wet season, it's this boom and bust thing. And as in so much of nature, death is just as much part of life as anything else, and crucial for it. So here's the ditch on the other side where the water was draining across the road, falling into here, and quite a few little juvenile piranha Cerosalmus geri in there, and they were predating all these tetras. And again, you can see the numbers of small fishes in there. We also found some Siphocarex. This is a little Crinochidae, Siphocarex boyadero. Mylosoma duviventre, which is a sort of silver dollar that gets about this big. They're here in my hand up here. And then the juvenile piranha Cerosalmus geri. And geri is actually a specialist in eating other fishes. A lot of piranhas, particularly in the Pantanal, they specialize in taking chunks of fin out of other fish, and then they swim away. But these guys are specialists in just devouring other fish. And we caught some little Ember tetras here too.
Didn't want to put the piranha in your pants this time?
No piranhas. I've only been bitten once by a piranha. It was entirely my fault. Where I caught him when I was unhooking him. He was only so. And as I unhooked him, he flipped and he fell, and I instinctively went to grab him. And my fingertip met his mouth on the way down. And I've described it as, those narrow pliers? It's like someone put narrow pliers on the tip of my finger and just, with all their pressure, crushed. Rather than slicing, it was crushing. And I put my finger in the water and he let go and swam off. And I had to have, we didn't have thread, so we just used super glue. And I just super glued the cut and wrapped something around it. But that was one very small one, so incredible. So yes, not putting them in my pockets. But we did find them here. Then I got into the flooded meadow on the west side, and you can see the strength of the current in this meadow. So this is all water that's draining back towards the river at this point. The waters are probably receding, which is why the road also was drying up. And it was between 1/2 and 2 feet deep. The visibility wasn't great. As you can see, there's loads of sediment being picked up by the current and blasted back. And again, these little characins here are engaged in this drift picking. So they sit in the flow, they nip up to grab something, zip around to grab something else. And they also, again, were assaulting me, picking at my eyebrow hair and leg hair and all the rest. But I'm in their territory. That's their prerogative. And you can see those grasses waving back and forth, really tannin-stained waters. And then I started to explore an area which is a wallow, where in the dry season the cattle go down to sort of roll around in the sand, have a sand bath. So it was more open area, and now it was submerged. And so I'm just crawling along with one hand and holding the camera with the other, trying not to turn up too much sediment. See there's very small characins there. And as I was going, I found a pike cichlid, this guy here, who didn't like me at all. Nips away. So he's a predator in that habitat. And then you see all these small tetras zooming out from the back. Sorry, the visibility isn't great. But all these small fish zooming out, and they're being chased by a juvenile peacock bass, cichler. So 2 predators in this flooded habitat. And here the peacock bass are native. They've been introduced to lots of parts of Brazil where they're not, and they've been introduced in Florida, as you guys probably know. And if you do ever go and catch them, please kill them, because they're really, really bad news for the environment they get added to. So the only aquatic plants that I found here, there was a kind of water lily. I wasn't really sure what it might be, and something that looked potentially like Bacopa salzmani, but I'm not entirely sure. I didn't have any botanist friends with me to identify it, but that was growing in there. If the meadow was flooded more consistently over a longer time, loads more lilies would turn up. You'd probably get cobombas appear. You'd probably get other aquatic plants. The seeds would be germinating and growing through there. But normally the lilies are the first, as soon as the water comes in, even 1/2 inch of water, the lily's already coming out of the ground, starting to grow. We found other fishes, so we found the peacock bass, the pike cichlid, members of Hemigrammus, Mulcausia, Mylosoma, the piranha in there, but as you can see, the visibility not great, so it's really hard to film. And also I'm trying to hold myself with my fingers in the substrate and not be blown away by the current and film at the same time. I did have one really nice moment though, where I spotted a cupid cichlid. And I stayed really still, and he came up and started foraging and even swam underneath me and was just grubbing around in the substrate. And that was probably the second highlight of the trip after the Ember Tetras, was just getting to observe this little fish in the wild. This is a species that's quite popular in the aquarium trade. They're really quite charismatic, they're quite engaging, they've got lots of character. So that was really, really cool to see. And as I was there, I was thinking, well, I haven't seen any Ember Tetras, but I'll get out of the water soon. And just before I did, this great shoal of Ember Tetras swam past my head. So I was like, oh, great. But again, I'm pursuing them with one hand, pulling myself along the substrate, the other hand trying to hold the camera. That gets old pretty fast. So I did it for a few seconds, and then I let them swim off into the gloom. But you can see they are enjoying swimming through the grasses here, and in quite a large shoal. So, and these are the guys that get lifted out of the wetland as the rains flood the road, and then deposited in those puddles. So to show you a little bit more of that puddle dynamic.
So it shows you that because we saw the egrets standing here, we thought, all right, if the egrets are there, then there's probably prey. So we stopped the car, we looked, and down there in that little stream is a shoal of Ember Tetras. So you often, when you're in the field, you look for stuff, but the way to find things is to let nature indicate, point out things, like look where the predators are, and you might find the prey items.
So we, in the edge of the road, in the little rivulets, were these small characters.
Shoal Ember Tetras in this flooded margin again, been washed across the road, flooded into here. Some bigger fish in here as well.
And again, you have to imagine that 40 years ago, this would have been forest floor, right? This wouldn't have been a meadow or a road or anything. This would have been leaf litter and twigs and stacks of roots and all the rest. And the fishes would have been doing the same thing. They would have been moving across that landscape. They're almost sort of journeying from one water body to the next. And it's hard to us imagine, oh, these little fish, they actually have ways of sort of teleporting across the landscape. And they still manage to do it even when we put roads in the way.
I got a question.
Oh, yes.
And then, if you could try to just, for the people online, if you could just repeat the question, if you can. Are you wearing camouflage clothing on purpose?
I'm wearing it because I buy it in a tackle shop, and that it doesn't really matter too much. It does help. In Brazil, context, in the water, it's great for getting close to the animals. It's difficult because of people, particularly farmers around here. If they see you in camo gear around their ranches, they might not appreciate that. The first warning is sometimes a shot to the head, which is a lot of the signs will say that near the farm. Where we were looking at those tetras swimming into the little culvert, we were there for about 10 minutes, and then we noticed 4 large trucks from the farm way down. We weren't in the farm, we were at the gate, but suddenly these guys came out of the farm buildings, got into 4 large trucks and started speeding towards us. And we said, we're going to leave. We've every right to be there. We've got our university truck with us. We've got our research papers, but you just don't want to. So I do wear camo clothing to try and get close to the fish, but it's not necessarily wise, and it's not vital, as long as you don't splash around. But this is a shirt that the tackle shops sell, and long sleeved with a hood, so I don't sunburn, and it's really thin material, so I can wear it in the water, nice and easy. Also, I'll just show you in here. This is in one of the little rivulets, just a few inches of water. You can see the sort of muddy substrate, and as I'm filming, these little Ember Tetras start zipping past. You can just about see them there. And I think that's pretty cool, they're just existing in that. And then, last bit as we were leaving, so again, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of water. So there's little Serpinus tetras swimming across the road, and then getting washed down into the meadow below us. And again, I think it's amazing that these animals, they just adapt to all the barriers that we put in their way, and they keep going. It might not be the most beautiful biotope to recreate, some gravel and sand and a road, but it's not biotope incorrect. So there you go. So of course I got to do this trip. Probably my wonderful professor, my supervisor when I did my master's, Dr. Fernando Carvalho. He's a specialist on Hyphus bricon and Serpe tetras. And he'd invited me to participate in this congress of ichthyologists there, which I did. And then I'd said to him, oh, I noticed we're only about 8 hours from where they find Ember tetras, which in Brazil is, or like here in the US, is nothing. 8 hours, I can get to Vienna from my house driving in Europe almost. But he said, yeah, let's go. And we met up with Dr. Fabrício Teresa. He's from the Federal University of Goiás. And there's a project called Araguaia Vivo. They're on Instagram. It's all in Portuguese, but they're a conservation research group. And they go up and down the Araguaia on a big boat, looking at all the different animals, fishes, and plants, and so on. So they kind of supported it. And that's how I was able to do it. And lastly, again, just thank you to all of you for coming and listening to me and giving me your attention. And thank you to all the organizers from the club who've been looking after me and brought me over here. If you want to see more videos about this on my YouTube channel, Biotopia, there's 3 different videos about this this expedition. I may try and put up a 4th one at some point. And if you guys have any questions, please just do ask me. But thank you so very, very much for having me here. We're also going to do a little demo of a tank, but
Okay, got it. Okay. All right, I think we're going to shut this down,
Okay.
and he's...
huh?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Okay.
Do we need a few minutes just to
Yeah.
talk amongst yourselves?
So, yeah, give us a couple minutes. We're going to set up, go back onto our YouTube channel. I'm sorry?
On mobile.
On mobile, and we'll be right back.
Is that okay?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.